With the growth of industrial revolution, the production process also began to grow. And inevitably, there was a growth of revenue as well. Now, when the profits started to come in, we see a development of industrial capital because of this industrial revolution. Now, there is a great phenomena that we see that sort of changed the pattern of the society, was that these profits and these revenues started to be accumulated at the hands of few people. Thus, we see the rise of certain classes who holds these revenues or the profits made through the process of industrialization. Thus, there is a massive impact on the society because of industrialization, which is the rise of social classes. Now, this rise of social classes showed the picture of how the society was divided into two classes primarily. The two groups of haves and have-nots. So ideally the capital wealth, the growth of capital wealth that was associated with the Industrial Revolution created the haves and the have-nots. Now, who were the haves? The haves were, of course, the capitalists. So the people who are holding the capital could be in terms of profit, could be in terms of means and modes of production, could be in terms of revenue, land, assets, or anything in particular, was the capital, and the people who owned it were called capitalists. So the haves were the capitalists, factory and business owners, also known as the bourgeoisie. So the haves were known as the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. Second is, ideally they had power, so they controlled the government, right? It was not the other way around. The government did not control their activities, they controlled the government policies. And third was that money, ideally all profits would go to the bourgeoisie or the capitalists. Now, who were the have-nots? The have-nots were the workers who were known as the proletariat. So once again, capitalists were known as bourgeoisie, workers were known as the proletariats. These people had low wages and poor working condition, ideally the people who worked in the factories. Thus, we see that there is a stark reality that is created by the coming of the industrial capital. As industrial capital kept growing, the difference in the society could be seen to be getting much more sharper. Now, if you see on your screen right now, you'll be able to see there is a social hierarchy, a social pyramid. This entire picture is that of a social pyramid of the Britain industrial class at that point of time. How the first money holding classes, the people who had the money bag, were the ones who promoted capitalism. So here we have the capitalists, the bourgeoisie. So capitalists were the ones who held the capital wealth and were known as bourgeoisie. Second, we had the people who ideally were the ones who supported religion, who were the foretakers of religion and ideally molded people by the help of religion. Therefore, the word that they use is that we fool you. So they use to fool people to get them to ideally believe in religion. So the third structure is the military. And they say we shoot at you. So military was basically a tool at the hands of the powerful people with which they put a check on the common people. The next structure that we have is that of the moneyed class, who say that we eat for you. So it was thought that the moneyed class usually would take the entire amount of the produce from the peasants. Now, the last strata of people who were the working class and were also known as the proletariat, are the people who are saying we work for all and we feed all. So they are the ones who are down below in this entire structure, and these are the people, these are the working class people who worked in factories and various other sectors. So with the rise of industrial capital, therefore we see that there is a stark difference in the society with the rise of new classes, with the rise of firstly the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie, who are right now on top of the structure, and then we have the proletariat who are down below, and in between these two classes we have the middle class, the people of religion, the military, and the moneyed class. Now, in this rise of social classes, if we try to look at a clearer pyramid, we see that we have the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. Now, the social classes in the Industrial Revolution were primarily based out of the financial status, amount of capital that they held. So, the financial status, which of course was derived from a person's position or working situation. So, imagine a person who is a factory owner would of course have the capital, would of course have the wealth, and therefore would be in the social hierarchy which is upper than the worker who is in a lower position. Thus we see that the upper class, who is the industrial wealthy and the bourgeoisie, the second class, which is the middle class, are the qualified professionals, the doctors, the lawyers, industrial technicians, and third is the lower class, who were the workers and farmers and were known as the proletariat. Now, as and when capitalism, kept growing, we could see that, these factory owners, these big businessmen, the people who invested in the businesses, invested in the industries, were also people who were really money-minded. They were driven by the profit-making policies and also, kept exploiting the most out of the proletariat class. So ultimately, what exactly, happened was these exploitative measures grew more and more because capitalism was entirely, depended on the exploitative modes. Without exploitation, capitalism was not possible. Why? Because capitalism would ideally state the fact that these people who held the profits were the only owners of the revenue, were the only owners of the profit, and the workers would get very low wages and no profits out of what they were doing, out of the output that they were giving in the industries. Thus we see that these capitalists were not pro-workers but pro-profit, pro-revenue. Thus capitalism and capitalists were the only ones who managed the means, modes, and other requirements of production. So they not only held the revenues or the profits out of the industrial growth, but they also held the modes and the means of the production and the other requirements that are there. So if we take an example here, it would rightly mean that if I am a factory owner, if I am a big businessman, then I own the factory, I own the machines, I own the laborers, I own the, the output, the raw materials, and in fact the revenue and the profit that comes out of it. Why? Because I feel that I am entitled to all of this because I have put an amount of capital, an amount of investment into making these industries. So automatically I feel entitled, and the way I am going to extract the most out of this entire process is of course by the mode of exploitation. So we see that capitalism ideally gave rise to, certain social evils as well. Why? Because if you take notice, then we are constantly focusing on the disparity that a capitalism and the capitalists try to create. Because like I said, if I am a factory owner, I would want to keep most of my assets. I would want to keep most of the revenue. Now, in order to do that, I, would not invest any money, any capital on the welfare of the workers, because that would cost me. I would not, invest money on paying the workers properly, because again, that would cost me and lower down my profits, lower down my revenues. So what these capitalists were exactly trying to do was, they not only were bringing in cheap labor, they paid them low, but also there was no regards for, the sanitation procedure, no regards for giving proper living conditions to the proletariat, to the working class, thus making them poorer and poorer. So we see that capitalism, the mode of a new economy, would ultimately give rise to certain social evils and really poor living conditions with high exploitation and extreme poverty. Like we stated, and we are constantly talking about the fact that exploitation was the ultimate driving factor behind capitalism to prosper as a new economy. Thus, in order to understand what exactly this mode of new economy is, let's look at its definition. So, capitalism is, of course, an economic and political system. Why? Because it not only held the economy, it not only made the economy prosper, but also had certain political policies attached to it, in which a country's trade industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So there was no say of the government. It was the private big businessmen, the factory owners who absolutely owned the profits, the modes, the requirements of production. The biggest impact that capitalism created was that of free market and free trade. Now, when these big businessmen started gaining profit, started to ideally get hold of a lot of revenue, they wanted more revenue, because we have been talking about the fact that the entire idea of capitalism is driven by the profit making attitude. So this was only possible if trading was made easier and trading was made without any restrictions. So the capitalists wanted the least amount of intervention from the government. Now, in order to do so, the great push was given by the policy of free market and free trade. The idea of free trade gave a push to the spread of industrial revolution and trade, and took place without any restriction. So the idea of free market and free trade not only sort of showcased and spread industrial revolution across the western borders, but also created the much needed profit, the much wanted revenue out of every system by the capitalists. As you can see in this particular picture, which is a caricature, this is a corporate American capitalist. This is the big corporate who owns the production system, the capitalist system. Now, these people supported free trade, and he is rightly saying free trade at last, free trade at last. Thank God Almighty, we have free trade at last. So free trade would mean he would not have to pay a penny. He would not have to pay heavy duties to trade with other countries overseas, other places overseas. Thus we see that both the US workers are also suffering. Now the workers abroad are also suffering, because there are lesser and lesser amount of profits that would go to the lower classes, whereas these big businesses, big corporates would be owning as well as gaining out of the new economic system. Thus we could say that free market and the rise of capitalism were reciprocal to each other. Both gave each other a push, and both made each other prosper in the market as well. So traders and capitalists wanted the least amount of intervention from the government, and the entire ideology was based on the idea of profit making. So you can understand here in this picture itself, a big businessman is not only, you know, paying low wages, but also is taking high rent for the living, the living costs that the people had to pay, the workers had to pay. So he is also paying high rent plus gaining low wages. Thus he is in a condition where he is being churned out through both ways. So the worker is not gaining anything out of the capitalist system, in fact is living in much poorer and poorer conditions day by day. But the capitalist system, the capitalist mentality was not happy with the revenue that it was making through the free market policy. It also wanted cheap labor. It also wanted cheap resources. It also wanted cheap service. And that could only be gained when Europe would move overseas to its new colonies and new empires. So ultimately we see that the new economic process of capitalism gave rise to the new imperialism as well. In new imperialism, European powers wanted to derive the maximum resource out of every possible avenue, and this avenue was the overseas empires, which were the colonies. Here you can see all the European powers and the colonies that they had all across the world. This is a map of 1914 showing all of the European colonies. And as we have discussed earlier as well, that the rise of imperialism was in fact an impact of the new economic system to derive the maximum resources out of the colonies. It was not only to dry from indigenous resources, but also to gain cheap labor and cheap services. So the profit-making idea gave rise to imperialism that the European colonizers took to derive maximum from their colonies. Second was that profit was primarily derived in terms of, as we were discussing, wealth, cheap resources, services, and cheap labor. Imperialism was created by Industrial Revolution, where capitalism also provided it with a major push. So Industrial Revolution, created the biggest impact in the way of imperialism with the growth of new imperialism, and capitalism provided an impetus to it, acted like a catalyst for the growth of imperialism. So we can understand that the rise of imperialism was in fact inevitable with the capitalist mode of production coming in, and also the capitalist economy gaining so much ground in Britain and in European borders, because the fact that the Industrial Revolution in fact created so much revenue and was possible to bring in a revolution in the mechanization process was only possible because big businessmen, the moneyed merchants, decided to invest into the mechanization processes. And without them, the growth of industrial mechanizations would never have been possible. So ideally, Britain did understand that with its vices as well, capitalism was an inevitable mode to bring in the modern age. Capitalism, in fact, was inevitable. Thus, capitalism gained more and more ground and created the industrial capital, the industrial wealth, which was the profit derived out of the industrial process. Now, with the rise of this new mode of economy, the condition of the workers, started to deteriorate to a level where they could no more take it. The most amount of poor living conditions, day after day exploitation, led the worker to now rise up and voice their own opinions. So we see that the exploitation of the workers led to the awakening of the factory workers, and this led to the demand that owners should only own the means and modes of production, should only own the means of production or the capital behind the production. So the investment is the only thing that the capitalists should be owning, the factory owners should be owning, was something that the factory workers demanded. Thus, we can understand what they aimed at was that the profit was to be divided equally among the people who were working, and also, should be distributed to the factory owner in terms of only investment and not in terms of the fact that he was investing. So, the profits and the wealth derived out of production should be distributed fairly was something that they protested for. So here is the Union of Workers protesting for equal rights. As you can see, not a penny off for the workers' wages, not a penny tax on food. So they were not ready to pay taxes if they were not being paid up to the mark. So the unions now started to gather around and protest for the rights of the workers. These workers, the proletariat, the working class, was supported by the socialists. The socialists were the people who backed the worker-owned economy, the state-owned economy, and had a more humane outlook to the economic system. So the socialists were the people who backed the state or worker-owned economy. So people like Saint Simon, Charles Fourier, Louis Blanc were the people who supported the workers owning the profits and also the modes and means of production. So these people were called utopians. But who are utopians? Utopians are the people who live in a state of utopia. But you might have a question as to what exactly is utopia. Utopia, if we take to define it, is a state in which the structure and functioning of the societal structures and organizations are in a desirable way. So to take a quick example of it and to make this definition easier, so imagine a society that is, that does not have any vices. That is an idealistic society. Does not have corruption, does not have poverty, does not have any crimes in it. Do you think such a society in a modern age is possible? Absolutely not, because that would be an idealistic sense of society. That would be thinking that such a society could ever exist. So that is a state of utopia, when a person thinks that this, in fact, this society, this structure of a society without any problems are possible. And the people who supported this, who thought that, utopia was possible, were the utopians or the primary socialists. As socialism started to gain ground, we see that new factions are arising from this ideology of socialism. And the most important ideology that factioned from socialism was that of Marxism. Now, in order to understand exactly what socialism is or Marxism is, we first need to realize what, is socialism. How do we take to define it? So, if we take to define it, it is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that first, means of production, distribution, exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. So not even the government, by the community as a whole, by the people. So the people are the absolute owners of all possible estates, right? And this is what socialism held as a theory. So as stated, one of the most important factions that was gaining ground was that of Marxism, which factioned out of socialism. So socialism as an ideology was gaining more and more ground. Now we have to realize the fact that though socialism was idealistic in terms of theory, because it was more theory than practical, sense, but socialism was much necessary at that point of time. Why? Because the vices that had come up due to the establishment of capitalism as an economic process, there were certain social evils that needed to be taken care of in order to change the state of the workers. So ideally, what needed a change was the state that the workers were living in and were working in. Thus we can understand that without ideological change, a societal change is never possible, and socialism rightly brought that forward, and that is why it was gaining more and more ground. So we understand that socialism in fact was created in order to oppose the vices of capitalism. With the growth of the amount of exploitation that capitalism had, and the fact that without exploitation capitalism was never possible, it could never prosper, socialism was in fact created as an opposing theory to capitalism. Second was the fact that socialists not only demanded better living conditions for the workers, but also tried to save them from exploitation by the capitalists. So the demands were, of course, not only to support workers, but also to save them from further exploitation. Third, the workers were living in poverty in contrast to the wealth that the capitalists gathered from mass production. So the capitalists and the capitalist system had, as we discussed, the profit-making attitude, the constant churning attitude to gain most amount of profit, most amount of revenue, not thinking about the welfare of the worker, which in turn affected the worker. Thus, the welfare of the worker came secondary for the capitalists. This is what the socialists wanted to bring a change for. Thus, we can understand that socialism as a theory, as an ideology, as a new economic process to gain that ground, there were certain factors that needed socialism to be pushed in the society, right? So that socialism would be accepted far and wide. So the first factor was that the amount of exploitation was, of course, the reason why socialism was created to oppose capitalism. The second factor was that the British government was pressurized by the growing union of the workers who wanted the worker rights, who wanted to gain the worker rights. So we see that workers, trade unions, strong trade unions pressurized the British government to recognize the rights of the workers. The protests demanded that the workers should be provided with better working conditions, security, and also should be relieved of poverty. So not only living conditions and working conditions, but also the fact that they were living in dire poverty was to be addressed by the British government. As you can see in the picture, these were the strong trade union protests that would be taken by the workers who would go on strikes on certain days. If you take a look at the left picture, then you will see that this is a women's protest primarily. So the workers trade union did not have a particular gender that protested. It was the proletariat who came to the streets to protest against the exploitation of the capitalists. So the third factor was that these workers did not have even the basic civil liberties. So the fact that the workers did not have the basic voting rights showcases that how less the workers were thought about, or how less the workers were considered a part of the society. So that was changed when the Chartist movement was taken in 19th century. So the Chartist movement focused on the right of the workers to vote. Now, though it failed, it did create a big platform for further social and political reforms for the change of the situation of the workers in the society. So can you tell me which movement aimed towards establishing the voting rights of the workers? Was it civil liberties, Chartist movement, human rights movement, or right to vote movement? The correct answer will be the Chartist movement. So we can then readily say that socialism was in fact derived out of the fact that it was to oppose capitalism. And the idea of socialism was that it opposed private ownership, it opposed the capital investment of private ownership, the profit making of the private ownership due to these investment, and ideally propagated the fact that the ownership should be held by the community, by the people. So there were many factions of the ideology of socialism, and as we saw that Marxism was now gaining more grounds. So we see that one famous ideology was that of Marxism. But who established Marxism is a question that we have to answer. So the idea of Marxism was brought out by Karl Marx, a German economist and a political philosopher, when he met his old associate in France, who was Friedrich Engels, in 1844. Now, Karl Marx and Engels gave a call to the workers, the working class, to come up and unite and fight against the capitalists. So we see that the theory was led by the social scientists Karl Marx and Engels when they called upon the workers of the world to unite and fight against the rising capitalism. The Marxian socialists wanted to set up a society that would be free of class divisions and exploitation. So basically, they idealized a society that would not have such stark divisions as the capitalists or the working class people, the proletariat, and neither will there be an exploitation of any particular class by the other. Now, the most effective and the vastly regarded theory of Karl Marx that he forwarded in his book, The Communist Manifesto, was that of communism. The Communist Manifesto was stated in 1848. It came out in 1848, which talks about the classless society, the emancipation of the working class people, and also the class struggle. The coming of capitalism as an economic structure was inevitable. Now, the requirements of the modern world could not be fulfilled with an idealistic approach. It needed modernization to come, and modernization could only come when there was a flow of capital. Now, capitalism ideally stated about that very concept, where it put forward the idea of the free market and moving goods without any restrictions. So capitalism was primarily concerned with the fact that wealth should be situated in the hands of few. Thus, those merchants or those moneyed class would be investing on the modern requirements. Of course, this also was the case that after capitalism came, imperialism could not be stopped, because the next step of capitalism was ultimately imperialism, where the colonizers would move ahead, colonize a place, and gain capital revenues out of the colonization as well. So we can therefore understand that the impact of industrial revolution could be seen with the growth of the ideas of capitalism, ideas of imperialism, as well as various other ideologies that are coming up. So to quickly look at the two ideologies that we have discussed today, and to look at it from a comparative point of view, we will need to analyze both of them together. So let's look at the comparative analysis of the ideas of capitalism and socialism. So first is the ownership. For a capitalist, the assets are owned by private firms, whereas in case of socialism, assets are owned either by the government or various corporations. Taxes. In case of capitalism, we have limited taxes, limited government spending because there is limited government intervention. For socialism, we have high progressive taxes and higher spending on public services. The factor of healthcare, when we talk about healthcare, the idea of healthcare is left to be decided by the capitalists themselves as to how much they would want to invest. So entirely the idea of free market is given priority. So they would know, the capitalists would know where their investments would finally land up in. Whereas in socialism, healthcare should be provided by the government for free because the entire amount, the entire capital wealth is for the public. Now the problems of capitalism was that it had inequalities, market failures, as well as monopolies of, let's say, any particular capitalist or any particular, organization. Whereas socialism had inefficiency of state industry as well as less incentives. What were the advantages? The advantages of capitalism was that it was a dynamic economy. It had incentives for innovation and economic growth, whereas socialism had promotion of equality, attempted to overcome market failure. Thus, we can understand by the analysis that both the ideas, both the structures had certain advantages and disadvantages, had certain pros and cons. Both the ideas later was taken by the world and they spread rapidly. But we could also understand that an idealistic society as seen by the socialists was also not possible because ultimately capitalism gave a push to various inventions and innovations.